Essential question 3 is, how did the Civil War transform the national economy and create a stronger nation state? It's important to note that, just as a general note for the entire course, the size and power of the US government typically grows during wartime. That's true of the Civil War, of World War I, World War II, and although it's not a war in the traditional sense, the Cold War. And you'll see this as we study these eras later on. So in the Civil War, Lincoln used his presidency to transform the United States into a powerful nation state. There was an upsurge in nationalism during the war. Nationalism is kind of an extreme devotion to country. It's sort of an extreme version of patriotism. And for many people in the Union, or rather many Republicans within the Union, criticism of the war was considered akin to treason. And Lincoln, as we said before, suspended habeas corpus, or the need to charge someone with a crime to arrest them. He suspended habeas corpus in order to silence critics, especially those in the border states. And the critics that this suspension of habeas corpus mostly targeted were so-called Copperheads. These were Northern Democrats who advocated peace. They advocated negotiating a peace settlement with the Confederacy rather than fighting the war to win it and to end slavery. For example, a prominent Northern Democrat, or a prominent Copperhead, was a man named Clement Vallandigham, who was charged with treason and thrown in jail for his anti-war speeches. Even though he's practicing his First Amendment freedom of speech, his criticism of the war was considered by Republicans a sort of an act of treason, and he's thrown in jail for that. We also see the Northern economy grow during the war. The North was already more industrialized than the South, and that trend is going to continue during the war as manufacturing boomed in order to supply the war effort. Farming actually did the same thing in the North. Speaking of which, the Republicans in Congress are going to push ahead with some elements of their platform, including the Homestead Act in 1863. And the Homestead Act was a law meant to encourage westward expansion, and it had been part of that 1860 GOP platform, if you'll remember. Here with the Homestead Act, settlers are given 160 acres of free land if they will settle in the West. Along with this Homestead Act, the Republicans passed something called the Land Grant College Act. It's also known as the Morrill Land Grant Act. It assisted states in establishing agricultural and mechanical colleges in order to train these potential homesteaders. The Republican Party also chartered two corporations, the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad, to build a transcontinental railroad across the United States. And again, this was part of the 1860 GOP, or Republican platform, if you'll remember. During the war, Lincoln also withdrew armies from the West in order to defend the capital of Washington, D.C. And this means that these Western armies couldn't prevent conflicts between white settlers and Native Americans on the frontier. And this led to events like the Sand Creek Massacre, where Colorado troops kill 400 Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children in, as the name implies, a massacre. So westward expansion for the United States meant a stronger nation state as it grew, but that of course came at the expense of Native American cultures, and we'll spend some more time on that later. The Republican Party during the war also passed a higher tariff or tax on imported goods to promote Northern industry, and again, this was part of the 1860 Republican platform. Finally, the Republican Congress established a national banking system during the war in order to try to provide a uniform national currency, which will be important in building a stronger economic nation state. Other changes that occurred during the war, or rather other social changes that occurred during the war, which are important to note, is first, women served in very important roles during the war, especially in nursing, which was a new field that women found themselves in out of necessity during the war. And this is going to lead to greater calls for suffrage for women, and the women's rights movement is going to begin to resume in force again around a bit after the war. Next, I want to come back to the idea that not everyone in the North supported the war. Certainly the Copperheads did not, or those Northern Democrats who advocated for peace. We've talked about them and how Lincoln and radical Republicans took steps to silence these critics of the war. But another stark example of Northern opposition to the war, and arguably even Northern opposition to abolishing slavery, were the New York City draft riots in 1863. The New York City draft riots broke out because of, first of all, obviously, the draft. Many people in New York, especially immigrants, did not want to fight for African Americans in the war, and they attacked draft offices as sort of signal their opposition. These riots were also about that $300 draft substitution fee. It was something of a class conflict, as you have poor people who could not afford that draft substitution fee attack wealthy homes in wealthier parts of New York City. There was also the motivation of racism, as there was a fear of a status change for African Americans, as they might, as we've said earlier, become free, move north, and arguably, and maybe take white jobs away in manufacturing. And as a result, African Americans throughout New York City were attacked during these riots as well. In the end, the U.S. Army had to be called in to put the riots down, and they actually bombarded New York City and put the riots down after about 2 or 3 days of rioting.